They weren't just warriors. They were storms wrapped in human skin. When enemies saw their faces on the battlefield, they didn't just retreat. They ran in terror. Today, we reveal the 7 companions of the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH, so feared, even the bravest armies trembled at their names. In the golden age of Islam, when truth clashed with tyranny, 7 men stood beside the Messenger of God, not just as friends, but as divine instruments of justice. Their loyalty was unbreakable, their courage supernatural, and their presence so overwhelming that hardened warriors dropped their swords and fled before a single blow was struck. This isn't just history. It's a soul-stirring testament to faith, fearlessness, and the power of standing with truth. If you believe in courage that changes history, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell, because stories like this deserve to be heard across the world. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, the first man to embrace Islam, wasn't just gentle, he was iron-wrapped in mercy. When the world turned its back on the Prophet Muhammad PBUH, when even blood relatives mocked him and threw filth on his doorstep, it was Abu Bakr who stood in the dust, eyes burning with loyalty, and said, "I believe in you, Messenger of God, even if the whole world calls you a liar." That wasn't just faith. That was defiance of darkness itself. At the Battle of Badr, the first great clash between truth and tyranny, Abu Bakr didn't roar like a warrior. He moved in silence, his presence calm, his breath steady. Yet enemies who faced him later confessed they felt as if they were fighting not a man, but a force sent from the heavens. One Meccan soldier, captured after the battle, trembled as he whispered, "When I saw Abu Bakr's eyes, I saw no anger, only certainty, and that terrified me more than any sword." He wasn't just the Prophet's closest friend, he was the living proof that gentleness and steel can coexist in one soul. And when the Prophet, PBUH, fled Mecca in the dead of night, hunted like an animal with a bounty on his head, it was Abu Bakr who crawled into the cave of Thor beside him, whispering through the darkness, "Don't grieve. Allah is with us." In that cave, with assassins circling outside, Abu Bakr wept, not for fear of death, but for the thought that a single hair on the Prophet's head might be harmed. That's the man they feared. Not because he shouted, but because his silence spoke of a loyalty no empire could break. Umar ibn al-Khattab, towering, fierce, and unwavering, was once Islam's greatest enemy. Before his conversion, his footsteps alone sent early Muslims fleeing into alleyways. He carried a drawn sword, vowing to kill the Prophet, PBUH, with his own hands. But on the road to Damascus, truth struck him like lightning. He heard the Quran recited, not as poetry, but as revelation, and his heart shattered open. From that moment, the man who once terrorized believers became their unshakable fortress. The Prophet, PBUH, himself said, "If Satan sees Umar walking one path, he takes another." And it was true. When Umar embraced Islam, the Muslims finally walked the streets of Mecca in daylight, not hiding, not whispering, but heads held high, because Umar was with them. His conversion wasn't just personal, it shifted the balance of power in Arabia. On the battlefield, he didn't charge. He advanced like a mountain moving. Enemies didn't just fear his strength, they feared his justice. After the Prophet's passing, when false prophets rose and tribes rebelled, it was Umar who stood before the armies of apostasy and declared, "By Allah, if you abandon even one prayer, I will burn your villages to ash." But here's what truly unnerved his foes. Umar wept openly in prayer. This giant of a man, whose voice could silence a riot, would collapse in prostration, sobbing for forgiveness. That duality, fierce warrior by day, humble servant by night, made him untouchable. Armies didn't just lose to him. They lost faith in their own cause when they saw him. Uthman ibn Affan, often seen as serene, carried a quiet strength that unnerved spies and traitors alike. Wealthy beyond measure, he could have lived in golden palaces, but chose instead to pour his fortune into the cause of Islam. He bought the well of Rumah and gave it freely to the thirsty people of Medina. He funded the Muslim army's entire expedition to Tabuk when the treasury was empty. And when the Prophet, PBUH, needed a Quran compiled into one book, it was Uthman who ensured its preservation for all time. But his true test came at the end. During the siege of his home, rebels surrounded him, demanding he step down. For 40 days, they cut off food and water. Yet Uthman refused to raise a sword against fellow Muslims, even as they broke down his door. In his final moments, he was reading the Quran. Blood dripped from his forehead onto the verse, "And Allah will protect you from the people." Quran 5 hours 67 minutes. His enemies expected rage. Instead, they found peace. That's why, even in rebellion, men hesitated to strike him. They remembered how he once gave away entire caravans to orphans, how he never spoke ill of anyone, how his eyes always looked toward the hereafter. His silence in the face of betrayal wasn't weakness, it was a mirror that forced his attackers to see their own souls. And that reflection? That's what truly frightened them. Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Lion of God, was just 10 years old when he pledged his life to Islam, sleeping in the Prophet's bed on the night of the Hijrah so assassins would think the messenger was still there. By the time he was 20, his name echoed across deserts and mountains. At the Battle of Khaybar, the Muslim army had been stalled for days by an impenetrable fortress. Morale was crumbling. Then the Prophet PBUH stood and declared, "Tomorrow, I will give the banner to a man who loves Allah and his messenger, and whom Allah and his messenger love. He will not flee. Allah will grant victory through him." The companions held their breath, each hoping it would be them. But when the Prophet called Ali, the camp erupted. And there he was, sick with fever, eyes burning, yet rising like a storm. He took the banner, charged the fortress alone, and tore down its gate with his bare hands. His sword Zulfiqar, gifted by the Prophet, became legend not for its sharpness, but for the justice it carried. Ali never struck first. But when truth was violated, his response was swift, precise, and final. Enemies said that when Ali entered battle, time itself seemed to slow, because even the wind held its breath. And yet, in private, he was a poet, a scholar, a man who wept for the poor. That contrast, between the warrior who could shatter armies and the sage who quoted the Quran to children, made him a figure of awe. No one could predict him. And in war, the unpredictable are the most feared. Talha ibn Ubaidullah, the living shield of the Prophet, earned his title in blood and sacrifice. At the Battle of Uhud, when the Muslim ranks broke and panic spread, the Prophet PBUH stood nearly alone on the mountain slope, arrows flying like rain. That's when Talha charged, not toward safety, but into the storm. He placed himself between the messenger and death, raising his arms to block arrows meant for the Prophet's face. One struck his hand, pinning it to his head. Another pierced his chest. Still, he stood. By the end of the battle, he had taken 70 wounds, yet never stepped back, never cried out. When companions finally dragged him away, his body was soaked in blood, his fingers still curled as if holding an invisible shield. The Prophet PBUH looked at him and wept, saying, "Whoever wishes to see a martyr walking on earth, let him look at Talha." Years later, during a rebellion, Talha was offered a chance to flee. He refused. "I swore to die for truth," he said. And when the fatal arrow struck him in the leg, he didn't scream. He smiled, and whispered the Shaida. Enemies who saw him fall didn't cheer. They fell silent. Because they knew, men like Talha don't die. They become legends that haunt the conscience of every coward who betrays loyalty. Zubair ibn al-Awwam, cousin of the Prophet Muhammad PBUH, was not just a warrior. He was a storm given human form. From the moment he accepted Islam as a teenager, his life became a blade forged in divine fire. He never lost a duel, never retreated, never hesitated. While others debated strategy, Zubair moved, silent, swift, and absolute. At the Battle of Badr, he dueled and killed one of Mecca's fiercest champions in under 30 seconds. At Uhud, when the Muslim lines collapsed, he held a narrow pass alone for over an hour, fending off waves of attackers with nothing but a broken spear and unshakable faith. But his most legendary feat came during the Muslim conquest of Egypt. Facing a heavily fortified Byzantine stronghold, the army stalled for days, until Zubair volunteered to scale the sheer eastern wall under cover of night. Barefoot, alone, with only a dagger and a rope made of twisted cloth, he climbed 60 feet of slick stone, slipped past sentries, and opened the gates from within. By dawn, the city was theirs. Enemies didn't just fear his strength, they feared his silence. He never boasted, never gloated. After battle, he'd be found in the corner of camp, praying, tears mixing with the dust on his face. That's what haunted his foes, a man who could shatter armies with his hands, yet trembled before his creator with his heart. When spies reported his approach, entire garrisons would abandon their posts, not because they were weak, but because they knew, where Zubair walks, victory follows like a shadow. 7. Abdurrahman ibn Awf, a merchant-turned-warrior, was the quiet titan of the early Ummah. Born into wealth, he could have lived a life of silk and ease. Instead, he gave it all away. When the Prophet, PBUH, and his followers were exiled from Mecca, starving and broken, it was Abdurrahman who arrived in Medina with nothing but the clothes on his back, and within weeks, built a trading empire so vast, he fed entire neighborhoods. But his true power wasn't in gold, it was in grace. He once gave away 40,000 gold coins in a single day to widows and orphans, then walked home smiling, carrying only a loaf of bread. On the battlefield, he fought like a man who had already surrendered his soul to God. At the Battle of Yarmouk, outnumbered 6-1, he led a cavalry charge that split the Byzantine army in half. Soldiers said his eyes held no rage, only calm certainty, as if he saw the outcome before it happened. After the battle, while others celebrated, Abdurrahman sat among the wounded, bandaging their wounds with his own cloak. That's why enemies whispered in fear, "He doesn't fight for glory. He fights because it's right." And that kind of man? You can't defeat him with swords. You can only kneel before his legacy. 8. These weren't mythical heroes carved from stone or sung about in fairy tales. They were real men, fathers who kissed their children goodbye at dawn, husbands who wrote letters to their wives from battle camps, traders who once haggled in markets and prayed in alleyways. They bled. They wept. They doubted. But in the crucible of crisis, they chose something greater than themselves. Truth over tribe, justice over comfort, God over survival. And that choice, repeated again and again in the face of exile, betrayal, and death, is what made them terrifying to tyrants. Because when a man has nothing to lose but his soul, and he guards that soul more fiercely than his life, he becomes unstoppable. Empires fall not to armies, but to men who refuse to bow. And these 7? They never bowed, not to kings, not to fear, not even to death itself. 9. Their fearlessness wasn't born of arrogance or bloodlust. It came from a place deeper than courage, absolute certainty. They knew, with bone-deep conviction, that if they died fighting for truth, paradise awaited them with rivers of mercy and the smile of the Prophet, PBUH. And if they lived, they'd carry that truth into every city, every heart, every generation. That certainty radiated from them like heat from fire. Roman scouts reported that Muslim camps at night didn't echo with drunken laughter or war chants, but with the soft, rhythmic recitation of the Quran. Persian spies wrote in secret dispatches, "These men do not fear death. They welcome it as a guest." And that's what broke the will of their enemies. You can defeat a warrior who fears pain. But how do you fight a man who sees martyrdom as a wedding night with eternity? 10. The Roman generals, masters of siege and steel, had never encountered anything like this. Before the Battle of Yarmouk, their scouts returned pale-faced, reporting that the Muslim army, outnumbered, underfed, and exhausted, was smiling. Not grinning in madness, but calm, serene, as if they already knew the outcome. One Byzantine commander later confessed, "We thought we were fighting men. But when the Takbir, Allahu Akbar, rose from their ranks like a tidal wave, I felt my soul shake." It wasn't a battle cry. It was a declaration that God was greater than empires. And in the front lines of that divine storm, these 7 companions, Abu Bakr's wisdom, Umar's fury, Uthman's patience, Ali's blade, Talha's shield, Zubair's silence, and Abdurrahman's grace, stood shoulder to shoulder, not as generals but as witnesses. Witnesses to a truth so powerful, it turned deserts into cradles of civilization, and made kings tremble at the sight of a single believer's face. Persian spies didn't just report facts, they reported nightmares. Hidden in the dunes beyond Medina, cloaked in desert robes, they watched the Muslim camps not with curiosity, but with dread. What they saw defied every law of war they knew. At midnight, when armies should be sleeping or drinking, these men were awake, not sharpening swords but bowing in prayer. Their voices didn't roar with threats, they whispered verses that seemed to make the stars lean closer. One spy, captured years later near Ctesiphon, confessed under interrogation, Their camps didn't glow with fire. They glowed with something else. A light that came from inside them. When they stood for far prayer before dawn, it was as if the darkness itself bowed. The Persians had faced Romans, Scythians, nomads, but never an army that treated the battlefield like a place of worship. These weren't mercenaries chasing gold. They were men chasing eternity. And that made them unpredictable, unbreakable, unconquerable. Because how do you defeat an army that sees death not as an end, but as a doorway? 12. At the Battle of Yarmouk, where 40,000 Muslims faced 240,000 Byzantine soldiers, the world expected a massacre. The Byzantines had armored cavalry, siege towers, and decades of military dominance. The Muslims had worn sandals, patched cloaks, and a faith so fierce it burned brighter than steel. But what happened next stunned history. As dawn broke over the Jordan Valley, the Muslim ranks didn't form defensive lines. They formed circles of prayer. And then, as one voice, they cried out, Allahu Akbar. God is greater. Not God is great. Greater. Greater than empires. Greater than fear. Greater than death. That single phrase rolled across the valley like thunder from another dimension. Horses reared. Byzantine archers froze. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And in the front lines, calm, resolute, eyes fixed on the horizon, stood the 7 companions. Abu Bakr, now aging but unshaken, raised his hand not to command, but to remind, today, we meet the promise of paradise. Umar's voice boomed like a war drum, rallying the broken-hearted. Ali unsheathed Zulfikar, its edge catching the first light of dawn. Talha, scarred from Uhud, kissed his sword and whispered, for the messenger. Zubair said nothing, just tightened his grip and stepped forward. In that moment, the battlefield wasn't just earth and blood, it became sacred ground. And the Byzantines? They didn't just lose a battle. They lost their illusion of invincibility. 13. Abu Bakr led not with fury, but with wisdom that turned enemies into brothers. After Yarmouk, when cities surrendered, he didn't demand tribute or humiliation. He walked into Damascus barefoot, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. He signed treaties guaranteeing safety for churches, synagogues, and homes. When a Byzantine bishop asked, "Why do you treat us with mercy after we tried to destroy you?" Abu Bakr replied softly, "Because the messenger of God taught us, whoever oppresses a non-Muslim under our protection, I will be his adversary on Judgment Day." That wasn't politics. That was prophecy in action. His leadership wasn't about expanding borders. It was about expanding humanity. And that's why even defeated generals wept in his presence. They expected chains. They received dignity. In a world where power meant domination, Abu Bakr proved that true strength lies in restraint, and that the most feared man is the one who chooses mercy when he could have taken revenge. 14. Umar's justice was so pure, even wolves respected his borders. When he became caliph, he didn't sit in palaces. He walked the streets at night, carrying a whip, not to punish, but to check if every home had bread. Once, he found a widow eating stale bread while her children slept hungry. He carried sacks of flour on his own back to her door, then sat outside until dawn, ensuring no thief came near. His court had no guards, only truth. A Bedouin once dragged Umar himself to court, accusing him of unfair land distribution. Umar stood as the defendant, listened in silence, and when the judge ruled against him, he bowed his head and said, "The truth has spoken." That moment echoed across empires. In Persia, kings ruled by fear. In Rome, by law. But in Medina, justice walked barefoot in the dust, and it terrified tyrants more than any army. Because when people see that even the ruler bows to truth, they stop fearing men, and start fearing God. And that shift? That's what collapses thrones. 15. Uthman's generosity fed cities during famine, but his silence in betrayal fed souls for eternity. When drought struck Medina, he opened his granaries and said, "Take all you need. Leave only what you don't." He didn't count, didn't record, didn't expect thanks. Years later, when rebels surrounded his home, demanding he step down, he could have called the army. He had loyal generals, thousands of soldiers ready to die for him. But he refused. "I will not spill Muslim blood to save my own life," he said. For 40 days, they starved him, threw stones at his windows. Yet every morning, neighbors heard him reciting the Quran, his voice calm, steady, full of light. On the day they broke in, he was reading Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 67, "O Messenger, announce what has been revealed to you from your Lord." An arrow struck his forehead. Blood dripped onto the page. Still, he didn't curse. He completed the verse, then whispered, "My Lord, forgive them. They know not what they do." In that moment, the rebels didn't feel victory. They felt shame. Because Uthman didn't die as a caliph. He died as a mirror, reflecting back their rage, their injustice, their broken oaths. And that reflection? That's the kind of death that haunts generations. Not with vengeance, but with grace so heavy, it bends the soul. Ali ibn Abi Talib's sword struck only when mercy had been exhausted. He never drew Zulfikar for pride, power, or plunder. Only when truth was bleeding on the ground and no voice would rise to defend it. At the Battle of the Trench, when the Confederate armies of Mecca and beyond surrounded Medina like a noose, it was Ali who faced Amr ibn Abd Wud, the undefeated champion of Arabia, in single combat. Amr was a mountain of muscle, covered in scars, feared across the peninsula. He laughed when Ali stepped forward, "I won't kill you, boy. I'll send you back to your mother in pieces." But Ali didn't flinch. He raised his sword and said quietly, "I fight not for glory, but for the one who sees the hidden." In 3 swift moves, it was over. Amr fell. The enemy army fell silent. That day, they didn't just lose a warrior, they lost their myth of invincibility. Yet, in victory, Ali showed no triumph. He knelt beside Amr's body, closed his eyes, and whispered a prayer for his soul. That's the paradox that haunted his enemies, a man whose blade could end empires, yet whose heart mourned every life it took. He once said, "Do not wish to meet the enemy, but when you do, be patient, for paradise lies beneath the shadows of swords." Not in the killing, but in the sacrifice. And that truth? It made tyrants tremble more than any war cry. 17. Talha's loyalty was a fortress no betrayal could breach. Even after the Prophet, PBUH, passed away, Talha carried his oath like a sacred flame. When civil war threatened to tear the Ummah apart, he didn't choose sides based on power or politics. He chose based on principle. He stood for justice, even when it cost him everything. On the day of the Battle of the Camel, as dust swirled and arrows darkened the sky, Talha rode into the chaos not to conquer, but to stop the bloodshed. He raised his voice above the din, "Brothers, lay down your arms. This is not the way of the messenger." But the storm had already swallowed reason. An arrow, fired not by an enemy, but by a fellow Muslim, struck his leg. He fell from his horse, blood pooling in the sand. Yet even then, he tried to rise. His companions begged him to retreat. He shook his head. "If I die calling for unity, then let me die." And as the light left his eyes, his lips moved one last time, not in anger, but in the Shahida, La ilaha illallah. There was no curse, no blame, only faith. And in that moment, the battlefield grew quiet, as if the earth itself mourned a man whose loyalty outshone even death. That's the kind of man they feared, not because he could kill, but because he could forgive, even as he bled. 18. Zubair ibn al-Awwam's courage made deserts tremble, not because he shouted, but because he acted. While others debated, he moved. While others feared, he trusted. After the Prophet's death, when false prophets rose and tribes abandoned Islam, Zubair was among the first to march into the burning heart of rebellion. At the Battle of Yamama, facing an army of 40,000 apostates led by the self-proclaimed Prophet Musaylima, the Muslim ranks wavered. But Zubair? He charged alone, into the enemy's command tent, cutting down guards like wheat, forcing chaos into their lines. His presence was so overwhelming that Musaylima himself fled the battlefield, hiding in a garden like a cornered rat. Later, when asked why he never sought leadership or praise, Zubair simply said, "I swore allegiance to the messenger of God, not to thrones." And that oath defined his life. Even in his final days, when political storms raged and old friends turned against each other, he chose exile over betrayal. He walked away from power, from armies, from legacy, just to keep his soul clean. That's the ultimate fear of tyrants. Not the man who wants to rule, but the man who refuses to, even when offered a crown. 19. Abdurrahman ibn Awf's faith turned gold into grace. He could have built palaces, owned fleets, lived like a king. Instead, he built mosques, fed widows and freed slaves, thousands of them. Once, after returning from a trade caravan worth millions, he gave away everything before even entering his home. His wife asked, "Did you leave nothing for us?" He smiled and said, "I left us something better, the pleasure of Allah." On his deathbed, he summoned his children and said, "I leave you no wealth, but I leave you a name that opens doors in heaven." And he was right. Centuries later, scholars would say, if you seek a man who balanced this world and the next, look to Abdurrahman. But his greatest test came not in life, but in legacy. When civil war divided the Ummah, he refused to take sides. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. "I will not let my love for one companion make me hate another," he declared. In a world tearing itself apart over loyalty, he chose higher loyalty, to unity, to peace, to the Prophet's final wish. And that choice? That's what made him truly feared, not by enemies, but by the spirit of division itself. 20. They weren't perfect, but their devotion was. They argued. They wept. They made mistakes. But never, not once, did they abandon the truth they had sworn to protect. And that's what terrified tyrants, not their swords but their souls. Because a sword can be broken. A soul anchored in divine purpose? That cannot be conquered. Roman emperors ruled with legions. Persian kings ruled with spies and gold. But these 7 men ruled with something far more dangerous, unshakable conviction. They walked into battles outnumbered, outarmed and outmatched, and still won, because they carried something no army could replicate, the certainty that God was with them. And that certainty radiated from them like light from a lantern in a storm. Enemies didn't just see warriors, they saw witnesses. Witnesses to a truth so pure, it made lies crumble. So when the dust settled and the banners fell, it wasn't the strongest empire that survived, but the one built on men who feared nothing but God. That's why, even today, centuries later, their names still echo, not in the halls of power, but in the quiet prayers of those who seek courage in a broken world. In today's world, where betrayal is common and loyalty is rare, their stories aren't just inspiring, they're urgent. We live in an age of filters, facades, and fleeting loyalties. Friends vanish with a swipe. Promises dissolve in silence. Truth is bent to fit convenience. But these 7 men, they stood when everyone else ran. They spoke when everyone else lied. They gave when everyone else took. And they did it not for likes, not for legacy, but because their souls refused to bow to anything less than divine truth. That's why their legacy isn't locked in the past. It's a mirror held up to our present. When you scroll through a feed full of noise and feel empty, remember Abu Bakr's quiet loyalty in the cave of Thor. When you're pressured to compromise your values for success, hear Umar's thunderous no, echoing across centuries. When you're tempted to hoard your blessings, see Uthman feeding strangers while rebels pounded on his door. Their lives aren't just history, they're a lifeline for anyone drowning in a world that forgot what honor looks like. 22. Imagine standing for truth when everyone else kneels to power. That's not just courage, that's revolution of the soul. These companions didn't wait for perfect conditions. They didn't demand guarantees. They stepped into the fire because it was burning. Ali didn't wait for a fair fight. He walked into the lion's den because justice needed a voice. Talha didn't calculate odds. He shielded the Prophet with his body because love demanded sacrifice. Zubair didn't ask for backup. He scaled fortress walls alone because faith doesn't negotiate with fear. And that's the question they leave us with today. What would you risk for what's right? Not in grand speeches, but in the quiet moments. When no one's watching. When it costs you everything. That's where real courage lives. Not in stadiums, but in silence. Not in headlines, but in the heart. And that kind of courage? It still terrifies tyrants, because it can't be bought, broken, or erased. 23. Their legacy isn't in monuments, It's in every heart that chooses courage over comfort. You won't find golden statues of Zubair in city squares. No marble halls bear Abdurrahman's name. But walk into any mosque at dawn, and you'll hear their echo in the footsteps of those who wake to pray while the world sleeps. Visit a refugee camp, and you'll see Uthman's generosity in the hands that share their last loaf. Stand in a courtroom where justice is defended against corruption, and you'll feel Umar's spirit in the voice that says, "This is wrong." Their legacy isn't carved in stone, it's written in choices. The single mother who works 2 jobs to raise her children with honesty. The student who refuses to cheat, even when it means failing. The whistleblower who risks everything to expose the truth. These are the modern heirs of the 7. Not because they wear armor, but because they carry the same unshakable light inside. And that light? It's still spreading. 24. When you feel alone in your struggle, remember, these men once stood against empires, with nothing but faith in their chests and the name of God on their lips. You are not the first to feel abandoned. Not the first to be called foolish for holding on. Not the first to stand in a room full of people, and still feel utterly alone. But in that loneliness, you're in sacred company. Abu Bakr felt it in the cave. Umar felt it when he walked Mecca alone as Islam's only public defender. Ali felt it when he chose justice over popularity. And yet, they stood. Not because they were fearless, but because their fear was smaller than their faith. So if you're fighting a battle no one sees, if you're carrying a burden no one understands, know this, you are part of a lineage older than nations, stronger than armies. The same spirit that made enemies flee at the sight of these 7 now lives in you, if you choose to awaken it. Your quiet integrity. Your hidden sacrifice. Your refusal to become what the world expects you to be. That is your banner. Raise it. 25. And that's why, centuries later, their names still echo, not just in history books, but in the prayers of millions who seek their strength. Children in Jakarta whisper Ya Ali before exams. Mothers in Mexico City light candles and ask for Umar's justice in their courts. Students in Toronto recite the story of Talha's shield when they feel weak. In Lagos, in Buenos Aires, in Chicago, people who've never met these men still draw courage from their light. Because truth has no borders. Sacrifice has no language. And loyalty to the divine? That speaks to every soul in every time, in every land. These 7 weren't just companions of a prophet, they became companions to humanity itself. Guides for anyone lost in the storm. And their message is as clear today as it was on the battlefield of Yarmouk. Stand. Even when you tremble. Speak. Even when your voice shakes. Love. Even when you're betrayed. Because the world doesn't need more power, it needs more people like them. And maybe, just maybe, that person is you. These 7 weren't just companions of the prophet, they were living miracles of faith. If their story moved you, share it. Let the world remember what true courage looks like. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because the greatest stories of light in darkness are still being told. Until next time, may your heart never fear standing for truth.